One of the most important tools that we have is organizing and people power. We have to show and organize around and mobilize folks to fight for additional protections to our right to vote. And that includes getting people mobilized in their state and local government, to hold folks accountable, to advocate for the types of policies that we want to see enacted.
So thanks so much, Amir, for joining us. Really curious to get your take on the importance of voter suppression as we think about the impact of this particular historic election. So if you could start with talking about your definition, kind of out the box, of what voter suppression actually is, and then talk a little bit about how it's changed in, this iteration of it, and maybe unfamiliar to some people what they think voter suppression is.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much, Kesha, for having me, and really appreciate having a forum to have this conversation. Voter suppression is something that we have lived with in the United States since the beginning of this country, really. It is, my definition of voter suppression are tactics, policies, procedures that either are intended or have the effect of making it more difficult for voters, and particularly certain categories of voters, to be able to access the ballot box and have their votes counted. And we have seen voter suppression take many forms over the history of this country. In this country's history, we've seen tactics like voter intimidation, violence, tactics to scare people away from voting, particularly Black people in the South have experienced voter intimidation to a large extent. We've also seen things like poll taxes, literacy tests, which were enacted after the Civil War and the Reconstruction amendments were passed, but were enacted in a purportedly race-neutral way. So they didn't actually say that they were going to apply mostly to Black voters, but they had the effect of mostly applying to Black voters because Black voters had lower rates of literacy after the Civil War for obvious reasons. Black voters suffered poverty to a greater extent for obvious reasons after the Civil War. And so those were tactics that were used specifically to target Black voters. And today we see different forms of voter suppression, but the tactics are really very similar, because we have seen, particularly after the 2020 election, when there was historic voter turnout among Black people in America, we have seen states enact voter suppression bills that are purportedly race neutral, so they don't say that they're specifically targeting Black voters or other voters of color, but they specifically target methods of voting that we know, based on the data, are disproportionately used by Black voters and other voters of color. And one example that comes to mind is drive-through voting in Harris County, Texas, which is where Houston is. In the 2020 election, Harris County was one of the only counties in Texas that used drive-through voting because of the pandemic. It allowed people to vote from the comfort of their cars and the safety of their cars. The data showed that Black voters and Latino voters were disproportionately likely to use drive-through voting in Texas. And just a few months after the election, the Texas legislature introduces SB 1, which includes a specific ban on drive-through voting. And so that's, I think, one of the kind of newer forms of voter suppression that we're seeing, is targeting these specific types and methods of voting that are known to be used by Black voters and voters of color.
Yeah, thanks so much for that definition, because it helps people to see that it can be at times very intentional, but it can be at times something that seems facially neutral. And when you were talking about, how voter suppression is something that has been, particularly with the Black community, like historic. We've been doing this a long time. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, although Black people had the right to vote, from the 13th Amendment Reconstruction, why did we still need the VRA to actually make that right accessible? And so tell us a little bit more about how the VRA helped us to fight some of these voter suppression tactics that Black voters have experienced.
Yeah. So after the Civil War, the U.S. Adopted the Reconstruction Amendments, like you said. So the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which provides equal protection of the laws and due process, and the 15th Amendment, which provides that states and the government can't discriminate, can't bar people from voting based on their race. And so together, these are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. And what we saw during Reconstruction was really a dramatic growth of political power because of these amendments among Black people in America. You saw really an explosion of the number of Black elected officials in the South. You saw registration rates among Black people in the U.S. Go up to 60-70%, down from, of course, there were no Black registered voters before then.
Yeah.
And so you really saw this dramatic growth of political power among Black people in America. And we know that what came after that was white supremacist backlash. We saw, constitutional conventions being called in states across the South using the Mississippi model of the 1890 Constitution, which introduced poll taxes and literacy tests and all forms of other voter suppression that, like we mentioned, had to be race neutral because they had to comply with the Reconstruction Amendments, which said you can't explicitly discriminate on the basis of race, but they were surgically focused on attacking ways that Black people voted. And so that led to Jim Crow in America. That led to the really significant reduction of registration rates and Black political participation. We saw Black elected officials go from the huge numbers we saw during Reconstruction to barely any Black elected officials in elected office across the country. And that persisted for decades. That system persisted for a very long time in the U.S. until we started seeing success in the courts. LDF was part of the movement that started the wave of change that we saw in the 50s and 60s, and that's also what persisted until we got the VRA in 1965, the Voting Rights Act, which was really, I think, one of the most, if not the most powerful pieces of legislation that has ever been enacted in the history of this country, because it got us closer to what it really means to be a democracy. And again, once the VRA was passed, which barred discrimination in the context of voting, it created a pre-clearance regime for states that had a long history of discrimination, particularly in the South. They had to, under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, pre-clear their new election policies or laws with the Department of Justice and show that they didn't discriminate against Black people or minority voters. And so it created a regime that really added protections to Black voters and their ability to participate in the political process. And again, what we saw after that was another just explosion of Black political power. Now, Black people truly had meaningful access to the ballot box. It didn't come without its flaws and its challenges. And, there was a period of time that, we had to rely on the courts and we had to do a lot to enforce those protections. But it really opened the playing field and allowed for us to get much closer, like I said, to the full fulfillment of our democratic values.
What I appreciate about what you're showing in this walk through history is that when Black people are given the opportunity to vote, that they take that in full force and kind of use the political power that they have in ways to advance other kinds of economic and social rights and securities. And their success, that huge Black participation, then triggers this, again, backlash of voter suppression. So we had this monumental legislation with the BRA. What happened? Like, why are we still battling the kind of voter suppression that you've been talking about and that we're focusing on in this conversation?
Yeah, I think that when, what we're talking about, this long history of the back and forth in voting in America, it's like a pendulum, right? It's, on one end, you see progress, on the other end, you see backlash to that progress. And I think what we saw after the VRA was enacted was a tremendous time of progress. And now we're in a period of backlash to that progress. And that started, I think, it didn't necessarily start in 2013. 2013 was an inflection point when the Supreme Court held in a case called Shelby versus Holder that the pre-clearance regime that I talked about earlier was unconstitutional.
And can you explain what pre-clearance is or means?
Yeah, absolutely. Under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, there are certain jurisdictions, so both local jurisdictions and states, that would have to pre-clear their new election laws or procedures with the Department of Justice before they could go into effect. And as part of the showing that they would have to make to the Department of Justice, they would have to show that these new laws or procedures didn't discriminate against Black people, didn't reduce their ability to participate in the political process. And so that was an incredibly powerful protection for Black voters, particularly those who lived in states in the South that had very long histories of discrimination. And it allowed for a structure where there was an ex ante check on states and local jurisdictions before voter suppression laws actually had an effect, right? That these laws could not go into effect until the Department of Justice cleared them. And so in 2013, in Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court, in a decision written by Chief Justice Roberts, held that the pre-clearance regime was unconstitutional. Essentially, that the formula that was used to determine which jurisdictions were included in the pre-clearance regime was outdated and no longer useful for purposes of determining which states or which jurisdictions had to fit within pre-clearance. And what that left was a huge void, because now we don't have an ex ante check on states and local jurisdictions. And it was really telling what happened in the immediate aftermath, because literally within hours and days of the Shelby County decision, we had states pass photo ID laws, other voter suppression mechanisms that had the effect of reducing the ability of Black people to participate in the political process. And that's the regime that we're under now. We don't have Section 5. There's been an effort to restore it, but Congress hasn't had the political will to do it. And then, the post-2020 era, I think, is also, important for us to talk about, and it really kind of exemplifies the impact of the Shelby County decision.
Yeah, so let's move to 2020. So we go into 2020 without these tools to fight voter suppression that, had been useful in protecting particularly Black voters in districts with a history of discrimination, that they couldn't start out trying to suppress votes. They had to prove it wasn't voter suppression, and now they don't. So then bring us to 2020. We're doing this election during a pandemic. What do we see in terms of voter suppression in these same communities that used to be under the BRA pre-clearance?
Yeah, so I mean, going back to kind of the image of the pendulum, in 2020, I think what we saw was really historic turnout among Black voters and other voters of color. And in the face of that dramatic exercise of political power, we saw within months of the election, states like Texas, states like Alabama, Florida, Georgia, passing legislation that both had the effect and was intended to suppress votes, and particularly suppress Black votes and the votes of other minority groups. And so since the 2020 election, states have introduced hundreds of voter suppression bills across the entire country. Dozens of those bills have been enacted in the 4 years since 2020. And these bills include really surgical ways to suppress votes. So I already mentioned the ban on drive-through voting in Texas. We've also seen a real attack on the ability of voters who need assistance with voting. So voters with disabilities, voters that need language assistance. We've seen limitations, restrictions, outright bans on the ability of those voters to get the assistance that they need. And LDF has challenged several of those pieces of legislation in Texas and Alabama. We've also seen a real restriction on the ability of nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations to register voters. Florida passed multiple pieces of legislation that limits the ability and imposes certain penalties on nonprofits for making small mistakes or small delays in returning voter registration applications. And that's resulted in really the almost nullification of all voter registration activity, third-party voter registration activity in places like Florida. And so these are just a few examples of kind of the backlash, the pendulum swinging back that we've seen over the past 4 years. And this is the environment in which we've been doing our work and trying to encourage folks to go out and participate in the political process.
Yeah, so we don't have the protections of the VRA. We had, thanks to the support of teams like Be Voter and other civil rights and voter rights organizations supporting voters in participating in the 2020 election in a time that there were health crises and very dangerous. And you did a great job, right? There's a lot of participation, and then precisely the rules, the assistance that supported voters in that were the things that get challenged. And there is no, they can enact these without the test. So how are you, how is LDF and our partner organizations kind of responding to those attacks that are coming in this, 2024 and beyond attempt to suppress votes?
Yeah, I think it has to be a multi-tactical approach because it's a multi-tactical assault on voting rights. And so we have to meet that with all of the tools that we have in the toolbox. And that includes, and that has included on LDF's part, litigation. And so we have filed lawsuits in multiple states challenging some of the specific voter suppression laws that I have already mentioned. And we've been successful in many of those lawsuits to challenge those voter suppression laws. It also includes advocacy, advocating at the state level to defend against attempts to pass some of these laws, and also more affirmatively advocating for laws that expand access to voting. We've been doing work in places like Mississippi, fighting for early voting. Mississippi is one of the only states in the entire country that doesn't have no excuse early voting. And so we've been working with partners to try to get that type of legislation enacted in Mississippi. We also have been doing a tremendous amount of work trying to pass state voting rights acts. So with the void that has been left through the Shelby County decision and other attacks on the Federal Voting Rights Act, we have been working on campaigns to get states to pass their own versions of a Voting Rights Act, which would add to the protections under the federal law, and that would bolster a lot of those protections, and also include state level pre-clearance regimes, so that states couldn't pass voter suppression laws without showing that they didn't have a discriminatory effect. Another tactic that we are using is state voting rights acts. And so part of our affirmative policy advocacy includes advocating to fill the gaps that have been left by these attacks on the federal Voting Rights Act through Shelby County and other decisions. And so a state voting rights act would bolster the federal protections, and it would add a state level pre-clearance regime. So states would have to prove that they are not discriminating against Black voters and other voters of color. And these campaigns we've been pursuing in multiple states across the country, and we think really lays the foundation for progress at the federal level as well. And so that's another part of our advocacy work. And then really, one of the most important tools that we have is organizing and people power. We have to show and organize around and mobilize folks to fight for additional protections to our right to vote. And that includes getting people mobilized in their state and local government, to hold folks accountable, to advocate for the types of policies that we want to see enacted. And then it also means mobilizing folks to ask Congress to do the right thing. Organizing is a key component of the strategy. And then we also have, education and communications, making sure that Black voters and other voters of color know and understand the various changes that are being enacted to the voting rights laws in their states, making sure that they have the tools and the information that they need to be able to cast their ballots and have them counted. And that's one of the key components of the work of Black Voters on the Rise, is to equip Black voters across the South with that information and those tools that they need to be able to participate in the political process.
Thanks so much, Amir, for laying out for us the varied ways in which we can be involved in fighting voter suppression and making sure that all people have access who are qualified to vote, have that opportunity to fulfill that. And I want to revisit this new form of voter suppression, and I want to ask you about mass voter challenges. That feels new to me. It's this new, or is this something that has been going on for a while, but I just haven't heard about it before?
Yeah, voter challenges are something that have been around for a while, but they're being deployed in a new way. And so when we talk about voter challenges, what we mean are essentially challenges that an individual can file to the eligibility of another individual to register or cast a vote. And that can happen at the poll site. We've seen historically, poll watchers challenge the eligibility of people to vote at a polling location in person. That could be also filed just before the election. And that's really where we've seen kind of the proliferation of these mass voter challenges. So in certain states, for example, in Georgia, there is no limit on the number of voter challenges that one individual can file. So we saw this during the 2020 election and the 2021 runoff election in Georgia. And we've seen it really in every election since then in Georgia and other states, where we see from a handful of individuals them filing hundreds of thousands of challenges against individual voters. And oftentimes, these challenges are nefarious and voter suppression mechanisms for a number of reasons. One is because they really gum up the election administration process. Mm-hmm. Think about if you're an election administrator at the county level, and just a few weeks before an election, you receive 100,000 challenges to the eligibility of voters in your county, and you have to go through every single one of them and determine whether or not that voter is actually eligible to vote in your county. That creates a huge burden on election administrators. And we've heard from election administrators that these are difficult for them to deal with and distract them from doing their very important duties around election time. These are also really nefarious voter suppression mechanisms because the challenges are often based on unreliable information, information that's generated from certain types of databases like the USPS National Change of Address database, which doesn't necessarily have either the most up-to-date information about where people live or accurate information about what their residence is for purposes of voting. And so these challenges have been filed on the basis of that type of unreliable information, and could, if they are accepted by counties, result in people being removed from the voter rolls improperly.
So, because I don't even think I could name 100,000 people in my county to write to my election administrator and say this. And so is the issue that people are actually doing research, like they're going out and getting some information that they're using with the explicit purpose of actually stopping, challenging these people's rights to vote? How are they doing that?
Yeah, so that's another area that has really changed over the last few years. What we've seen is that there have been new technologies developed that rely on tools like, for example, there's one that's called Eagle AI, or it's pronounced Eagle Eye. It's essentially a technological tool that allows individuals to generate mass voter challenge lists in the matter of seconds or minutes, using databases like the one that I talked about, the National Change of Address database. And so we're seeing these tools kind of being widely available to the public, and we're actually seeing election denier organizations developing their own tools and training people on how to use them. And so they have allowed the proliferation of these mass voter challenges in several states. Even in this prior election cycle, the 2024 election cycle, we saw many, many voter challenges filed using Eagle Eye and other types of similar technology.
And so you mentioned that, some of the resources aren't actually accurate, but they still create this large volume of lists that election administrators have to go through. What's the process that they have to go through for each name on that list to determine whether or not that person is eligible to vote?
So that process looks a little bit different based on each state's law, but in general, they have to, I can use an example. In Texas, it requires an individual determination for each of the challenges that have been filed. So the election administrator has to go into their centralized voter registration system, look at the address that's listed in that voter registration system, figure out if that's an eligible address. If the person has moved, they might have to do some type of outside research to really understand whether or not the information that's been provided on the challenge is accurate information. And so it's not as though some of these can be considered in kind of an aggregate basis. Oftentimes, each of them requires an individual determination. Now, luckily, an LDF and other groups were able to advocate local election officials in the 2024 election cycle to, essentially reject the vast majority of these challenges, because many of them were filed within the 90-day period before the election, where county officials cannot purge the voter rolls under the federal National Voter Registration Act. And so for that reason, and as a result of a lot of the incredible advocacy of civil rights groups like LDF, we saw the vast majority of these voter challenges rejected. But even though that they were rejected, one of the really harmful effects of these voter challenges is that they create a narrative that the voter rolls are bloated and they're filled with people who are not eligible to vote. And those are the same narratives, and we saw this happen, those are the same narratives that are used to undermine confidence in the election and to attempt to overturn the results of the election. And so those are some of the really scary tactics that have been used. And luckily, we've been able to fight against them, but there have been a lot of attempts like that we've seen.
I want to obviously thank you and Be Voter and all of the voting rights organizations who have fought against these modern forms of voter suppression. But in listening to you talk about the power of narrative, I want to think, what can we do, those of us who aren't lawyers, those of us who are kind of listeners, just everyday people who love our country and love democracy and want to ensure that all eligible voters are able to cast their votes. What are some of the things that we can do to support this kind of work?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that people can do, obviously vote. That's number one. But also, I think it's hugely important for us to remember that democracy doesn't end with voting. It really just begins with voting. And so one thing that we are particularly focused on in this time period after the election is encouraging and equipping people, all Americans across the entire country, to participate in their own governance. And that could mean showing up to your city council meeting or your school board meeting and providing public comment. It could mean showing up at the legislature and advocating for particular types of bills that would expand access to voting, like the state voting rights acts that I mentioned. It could be organizing your friend group or your family members to talk about particular issues and really help educate folks about what the main issues are. It could look in a number of different ways, but I think it's really important for us to remember that November is not the only time for us to participate politically. It's really a year-round thing, and there are so many different ways that you can participate. And that's one thing that I know that the Black Voters on the Rise team and LDF is really focused on. And we'll be working with communities to help educate folks on the political process and equip them to participate in, their local board meetings, like I mentioned. But it's a year-round 365-day endeavor.
I love it. There's a place for all of us in this work, and the work doesn't stop after the election. So thank you for the work that you do to defend democracy, and thank you for taking time to sit down and talk with us. I'm going to ask you to help us understand what redistricting is and its relationship to the census. So we were talking about voting and why it's important and how it's a year-round thing. So, this census happens every 10 years. Why is that such a big deal? And what does that have to do with political power?
Yeah, the census is such an important process and event in the U.S. politics and just our entire kind of government process. And so what the census is every 10 years, the U.S. Census Bureau essentially counts how many people are in the country. And they not only count like numerically how many people there are, but they generate a bunch of demographic data that helps us understand who people are, where they live, how they identify. And that data is then used for a variety of different purposes. One of the most important things that it's used for is to determine things like federal budget, like how much money is allocated to certain types of legislation and certain types of projects across the country. And so it's really important for people to be counted so that each jurisdiction gets the appropriate amount of money for projects in those jurisdictions. And, for our purposes, the census is also really important for purposes of redistricting. And so when we say redistricting, what we mean is the redrawing of political boundaries. And so it can happen at a number of levels. At the federal level, it happens in Congress. And so your congressional districts in your state, every 10 years after the census happens, based on the data generated by the census, your state will redraw the boundaries for congressional offices. It also goes through that same process for state legislative offices. So your state house, your state senate. It also goes through the same process for county level offices. So if your county has a board of supervisors or a school board, they also go through redistricting. Same thing for your city council or your city wards. And so redistricting happens at all levels of government. And the reason why it's so important is because it really determines how political power is allocated in our country at all of these levels of government. And so it determines who gets to be within certain districts, who gets to be outside of certain districts. And it can be used in ways that really either maximize certain people's political power or minimize certain people's political power.
So this map drawing is not just because people like to draw and make things look different. It really is that who gets included and who gets excluded around these maps determine how much power you have to kind of have your representatives be responsive to you. And I know LDF has spent a lot of resources in ensuring that we have fair maps that allow Black voters in particular to have, amass political power through the redistricting process. So can you talk a little bit about our work in Alabama and Louisiana and that fair map drawing process? Kind of what did we do and why was that important for voters in those respective states?
Yeah, in both Alabama and Louisiana, Black voters comprise nearly a third of the population, yet they only are represented at the congressional level in about 1 out of 6 of the congressional districts. And so what that means is that in 5 out of 6 of the congressional districts in both states, the Black voters who vote in those districts don't have a meaningful opportunity to elect their candidate of choice. And so that means that they're not able to effectively exercise their political power in 5 out of 6 districts in both states. And, the same dynamics exist at the state legislative level. The numbers are a little bit different, but the same dynamics exist in many of the state legislative districts. And so what LDF and several other organizations, both national and state organizations, did after the census data was released is advocate to those legislatures to draw the boundaries in a way that gives Black voters in those states meaningful opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. And at the congressional level, that meant to draw an additional district, one more additional district that would give Black voters a meaningful opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. We worked with some incredible organizers and advocates on the ground who mobilized people for months to participate in redistricting hearings, provide public testimony, talk about why their communities should be kept together and why they needed the opportunity to be able to have fair representation and have their preferences expressed in the legislature. And after all of that advocacy happened, both legislatures in Louisiana and Alabama adopted redistricting maps that were not fair, that did not give Black voters the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. And so LDF and our co-counsel filed lawsuits in both states, both against the congressional redistricting maps and the state legislative redistricting maps. And in both states, our lawsuits have been successful. And so at the federal level, we were able to win an additional congressional seat for Black voters to elect a candidate of their choice. And that, in Alabama, our case went all the way up to the Supreme Court in a case called Allen versus Milligan. Dwell Ross, Deputy Director of Litigation here at LDF, argued that case at the Supreme Court. And it was a really important case because many members of the civil rights community, the voting rights community, were fearful that the Supreme Court would continue to chip away at the protections of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which was the basis of our lawsuit. But we were able to secure a win in that case and an opinion that really upheld the sanctity of the Voting Rights Act and of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So we were really happy with that win, really happy for Black voters in Alabama, and that helped us secure our win in Louisiana as well. And that win has helped us secure additional districts across the country. And so, really just a huge win for Black voters across the entire country.
Yes, it sounds like it. And can you talk a little bit about how that win from having these fair maps or fairer maps now enabled Black voters in Louisiana and Alabama in this most recent elections to elect their preferred candidate?
Absolutely. So this was the first election in which the new congressional districts in both Louisiana and South and Alabama were in effect. And so in both states, Black voters were able to elect their candidate of choice for the first time in a very long time, or really ever. Voters in those districts were able to meaningfully exercise their political power. And so Black voters in Alabama elected Shomari Figures as their candidate of choice. And in Louisiana, Cleo Fields is their candidate of choice. And so they will, for the first time, have representation at the congressional level, which is incredible. And I think also, one of the important lessons that we learned from this process is that when voters feel like their power can actually be exercised, when there's power behind their vote, they actually turn out to vote. And so we saw turnout in these areas, in these new congressional districts, increase from prior elections because voters in those districts now understood that they had a meaningful opportunity to elect their candidates. And so it really tells the story of how important it is for us to have fair redistricting maps, because it doesn't just mean that, we redraw the lines and they look different. It really means that we get more people engaged in the political process, which is ultimately what we are shooting for.
Yes, and that they have the opportunity to have a political system that's responsive to them. So thank you for telling the whole story and helping us to connect the dots between voter suppression then and now, and the resistance that LDF and other voting rights groups have done to support expanding everyone's opportunity to vote. So thank you. Thank you for spending this time with us. And I think that concludes our interview.
Thank you so much.